And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of a film.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. We have a returning guest on the podcast today, filmmaker Robert Bonomo, who joined us about a year and a half ago for his film series, The 21 Faces of God. He's back with a new film called Twilight of the Archons, which I cannot recommend enough. It's really good, much shorter, easy to digest. It takes about an hour to watch it. It's on YouTube. Highly recommend it, guys. That's going to be the topic of conversation for the majority of this episode. So I hope you guys enjoy it as we dig in, but in any case, make sure you go and check out the film. It's very good and well worth your time. Before we jump into it, if you haven't already, please take a moment to go out to your podcast platform of choice, leave us a review. 5-star review does more than anything else to help this show grow. So if you could do that, we greatly appreciate it. For those of you who have supported us through PayPal or Patreon, very, very much appreciated. Thank you for your donations and your continued support. Every dollar that goes to this show goes into marketing and promotion. So thank you for continuing to support us and help us grow. As you know by now, I'm a terrible self-promoter, so those of you who have managed to find the link to the PayPal and the Patreon, etc. on your own, you guys are the real MVP. So thanks for that. In any case, I will leave a link to the website and the donation information in the show notes, so feel free to take a look there. And without further ado, let's jump into it. Robert Bonomo, Twilight of the Archons. Robert, welcome back to Eschaton.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's been great reconnecting with you here. We talked a little bit offline before we started recording here, and it's been good to catch up, learn a little bit, about yourself and about the film, about your work. We talked about 18 months ago. It's almost been 2 years, actually, since I had you on for 21 Faces of God, I believe. And, we got a lot of good feedback from our listeners after that show. And the audience asked if you had. I've had several folks in the audience over the last year ask if you were going to be back on the show or if there was any other content. I've directed a few folks to your YouTube channel. Twilight of the Archons, your new film, is a bit different in terms of not only the content, but I would say just in terms of the applicability for a lot more people, because your audience, I think 100% is going to be able to relate to the subject matter in Twilight of the Archons. And without spoiling it or giving too much away, because I'd like you to give a synopsis of the film, I'd like you just to kind of talk about the journey in terms of, what prompted you to create a film like this, and, what ultimately are you trying to achieve and accomplish with releasing it now?
Sure. And I just want to say, I really enjoyed our last interview. And I think it was one of the best interviews I did on the 21 Faces of God. I think what happened was, if you remember from the end of the 21 Faces of God, there was percolating something about consciousness. It was kind of bouncing, or I was playing around with that idea at the end of that film. Originally, this film emerged about the same time as the 21 Faces of God. So I wanted to make something more political, social, more mainstream for a bigger audience. But what happened was, the more I got interested in consciousness, the more this film became more about consciousness and less about the social issues. But I wanted to incorporate them somehow. And so I began this film pre-coronavirus. I've been working on this film now for almost 3 years, about 2.5 years. But I had to restart it because I had finished. I did the introduction, and I thought, how can I make a film in the middle of the coronavirus? And then last summer there was a lot of upheaval in the elections and everything, and I couldn't finish it. And then I guess it was about 6 months ago it finally hit me. Okay, I need to continue talking about myths like I did in the last film. But I wanted to combine two interesting myths. One was the myth of money, and the other was our idea of what consciousness is. And I think really the film is about, in the current paradigm, what do we consider consciousness to be? I mean, in the materialist paradigm, and what is it really? And also, what do we consider money to be, and what is it really?
Mm.
And I try and kind of make a connection between the two and show that what we think money is, it really isn't. And when we consider consciousness to be, it's really something else. And that was what I was grappling with while I was making the film. And that was what I attempted to sort of resolve in it.
Yeah, as I was watching the film, a lot of immediate overarching themes kind of pop out to you right away that I think most of us could relate to. And the timing is uncanny given the COVID world where most of us find ourselves locked down, maybe staring into a computer screen for our work and also for pleasure. I mean, one of the first themes that pops out is man's relationship with modern materialism and consumer mentality. So you talk about technology, you talk about basically the castration of man's transcendent nature or the spiritual side of man and how we more or less become robots or cogs in a wheel, serving a digital artificial material master. And, what I appreciate most about the film is the applicable nature of so many of these themes into all of our lives. Like you just touched on the banking industry. You talk about finance and how that's been kind of designed to manipulate us. You talk about marketing. And then you talk about just, the lack of a transcendent or a spiritual, basis or core or foundation, which I could really relate to, not only on a personal level, but just what I've observed in, macro trends and culture as well. Going back to 21 Faces of God, I think that film, while it was great, it was much more in depth in terms of, I think you had to have more of a foundational knowledge to really interact with that film. It was a much longer series, obviously, and also dealt with more esoteric themes. This one, while it was esoteric, it was also existential. This one, you could say it has some of the esoteric flavor, but is much more just existential in nature and kind of ties into our day-to-day existence here on this earth, especially in the developed world. So I just wanted to say, I personally found a lot of value in that. And I think that my audience is going to as well. I've already directed several people to the film. And I think that the reoccurring theme that a lot of people are going to touch on right away is that relationship between materialism and consumerism. And then also that separation or the disengagement from the transcendent side of things. Is that a direction you're trying to go with the film, or did you have that in mind while you were kind of framing the concept?
Absolutely. That's exactly where I was going. I was kind of sucked into it. Are you familiar with Alex Tsakiris, who has the podcast Skeptical?
I'm familiar with it. I've heard a couple of episodes. I don't subscribe to it though.
Right. I use that line. He has that famous line that biological robots living in a meaningless universe. And it's a great meme, no? That and I use that. I actually use it, and I quote him in that. There's a sense that that's where we're going. And I think when you look at that and you say, well, what myths, what overarching global myths are emerging? Yeah. And I really think the whole idea of the singularity, that idea, combined with, say, simulation theory and all this stuff, this is what seems to be bubbling up. And I'm not putting a judgment on it. I'm not saying it's good, it's bad, because I think myths aren't created. Myths emerge. You can't, it's like a brand. In marketing, how many people have tried to create a brand? It just doesn't work. If you set out to create a brand, it just never works. Brands just emerge, right? And myths are the same way. And so the myths that are emerging now, they're pretty cold. I mean, they're fun, they're exciting, intellectually stimulating, but they can leave you a bit cold. And that's what I think one of the major themes of the film is.
So you say they just emerged. Would you say that they emerge because they appeal to, certain base senses that make us drawn to them, these brands or these myths? Or would you say that there's some sort of underlying story or narrative? Because I've always grappled with that myself. Why do some ideas or some brands succeed while others fail? Is it because we see something in them that we see in ourselves, or maybe something missing in ourselves to aspire to? Or is it just kind of this, throw it against the wall and see what sticks mentality?
It's a fabulous question. From a marketing standpoint, because I used to work in marketing, I never forget when I was working in the early 2000s, Google, you just knew the first time it just hits you, it's like, this is gonna, it's just, and actually, and the whole idea of it becoming a verb, why does that happen? I think for me, I would go back to sort of the Platonic idea of these Platonic forms and archetypes. Maybe from a Jungian perspective, it might be more of an archetype. But I don't think it's something that's created. I think it's something that's discovered. I think archetypes are more uncovered than created. And you kind of, and like you said, you throw everything at the wall, see what sticks. But what sticks is what's already been, you know what I mean? It's uncovering, it's finding something that's there, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. I still haven't fully formed, my own opinion on what I think causes the genesis of it. But like yourself, I've seen brands and I've seen companies come around, kind of a side desk thing that I'm really interested in is investing in the stock market here in the US. And I'll look at brands that are going to be a success, 10 years before they even take off. Now, I don't always get it right. Like you look at some of the hot ones now, like Tesla's market cap is, and this isn't a finance show, so I'll just brush over this quickly, but Tesla has gone from, a really small market cap to being almost worth $1 trillion in pretty short order because of the story that it tells and the promise of the future. And I see things like that. And you go back to Amazon or a Google, from the last generation, it makes you wonder, do we notice that these things are primed for success? And when I say we, I say the people who are really paying attention to it. I mean, obviously the mass population is probably going to miss it or maybe not be interested, but I think those paying attention kind of just know there's certain ideas or there's certain brands that just appeal to them. And I've always wondered, is there some sort of muse behind that? Or is it just, marketed really well? Or, I don't know if I'll solve this in a 45-minute interview, but I just think those are interesting questions. And your film kind of ventures down that path.
Just to touch on Tesla for a second, the story of Tesla, I think is what's almost most interesting. I mean, when you listen to Elon Musk and you hear we're going to Mars, we're making electric cars, what's the thing with the brain? What's it called? Neuralink.
A Neuralink, yeah.
How can you not? I mean, it's like all the science fiction movies that were ever made in one guy.
Right.
How is that not going to work? And then you look at him and just the way he is, it's extraordinary. It was funny. I was talking to a friend of mine who invests a lot. What's the price to earnings now of Tesla? It's like 1,000 something.
Yeah, it's ridiculously out of proportion. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but it's well excess of several hundred.
You'll understand. But if I remember correctly, price to earnings is yearly earnings, right?
Yeah. The PE ratio is determined each year, and it's based on total year volume of sales.
So when you think about that, when you just kind of put that in perspective, just say, this means in 1,000 years, I would get my money back.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's a little out of whack, but it's just kind of funny because I remember my old man, who was a big investor, 10, 12, if it got over 15, he was like,
it's frothy.
Overpriced.
Yep. Well, that's the norm in the market now. Yeah, I know. And now they're going for like 45, 50 on average. But the thing with Elon is like, I don't know if you've seen any of his interviews. Like he'll go on the Joe Rogan podcast. He was just on a couple weeks ago. And it's almost like a church service. Like there's so many listeners and you follow his fans on Twitter. People hold on to every word. And if he says one thing about the next model, Model S or whatever the future thing is going to be for Tesla, the stock price will jump, or he'll post a tweet and something will cause the price of Bitcoin or the price of Tesla to go up. It's like this promise of a new world, like tapping into something, this deeply held desire within ourselves. Like he has this company Starlink, which he's spinning out from SpaceX, which is basically going to make high-speed internet available to anyone, anywhere in the world, because it's based off, satellites and not off local networks. So, like you said, it's like he's everything rolled into one about this futuristic paradigm. And it makes me wonder how much of that is due to the current zeitgeist and how much of it is due to, underlying ideas within ourselves. But I digress.
Yeah, but he fits into that archetype of somebody who's really exceptional, and it's not a judgment on what he's doing is good, bad. It's just you can't deny the fact that he has that power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's important. Well, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, as I'm going through the film, kind of talking about this idea of machine and this almost cyborgian zeitgeist that has taken over the current world. This idea that man and machine will live in harmony together, and that there will be only positive at the root that comes out of that. You have an interesting line early on in the film. It said, to be a human without a transcendent narrative is to be a machine completely at the mercy of biology. And that really stuck with me, because I see that not only in my daily life, working remotely right now through a computer screen, and just the way we entertain ourselves and engage with technology in our daily lives, but in every aspect of life, I see this hollowing out of the spiritual side, or the transcendent side of our lives, which used to be, I would say, a foundational cornerstone of it. We lived so much of our lives in accordance with nature. And because of that, I think nature and spirituality kind of are one and the same. They go hand in hand. It's been hard, being separated from nature to maintain that relationship with spirit. And even in religious context, churches have become more digital and more culturally relevant. Religious organizations have tried to take their presence online. And in my mind, I think that's hollow. I don't think it translates in any sort of organic way for the most part. You see religions kind of just conforming to culture, and it becomes a hollow brand, like you were saying earlier with branding. So what do you think? I don't want to kind of give away the ending here, but I kind of want to just venture down the path of, what's the remedy here, and what ultimately is the path that you think we're on. I think you kind of put your finger on the pulse of where we are in terms of man becoming more of a mundane biological machine. Basically, where our bodies are just vehicles for our brains. Do you see that as kind of culminating in this, Kurzweilian idea of a singularity, or do you think that this is kind of an illusion, leading to this, quote unquote, Twilight of the Archons? What path do you think we're going down?
Well, of course, it's an illusion, because it's a story. It's a myth. I mean, what Kurzweil is selling us, and I don't mean in a negative way, offering us is a story, and we live by stories, right?
Yeah.
We all have a story. Now, there are stories that will serve us well and stories that might not serve us so well. I don't even have to mention them. There are certain stories, myths that we can latch onto that are going to help us, and some that aren't going to help us. And this story of the machine saving us has obviously been in our culture for a long time. But now I think it's reaching a point where we're reaching an inflection point with it. I mean, because you were telling me you work in this type of industry, you probably have even a really clear idea of where artificial intelligence, for example, is taking us. And more importantly, how far along we already are. So how many decisions are already being made through this?
Yeah.
And as we move forward, I think this is just my opinion. I think you would understand this much better than I do. My feeling is we're farther along than most people suspect. What would you think about that?
I would agree with that. Yeah. In my industry, in management consulting with a technological focus, the conversation is almost exclusively now in terms of product improvement or process improvement, exclusively around AI and machine learning. Not only do we want to have artificial intelligence, but we want machines that can teach other machines. And I'm seeing this be implemented, at an accelerated pace year over year in my industry, and have been for the last few years. But it permeates every industry, consumer retail, finance, healthcare, you name it. Everybody is shifting toward AI. And the end goal here is to minimize the decision points for human beings and to maximize the automation and the machine learning and the self-replicating, self-teaching processes of the computers. This will basically, in theory, free up humans to make bigger, more macro decisions. In practice, what I think that's going to lead to, not that it'll be all bad, but I think it's going to lead to a system where it's more hands-off and more disengagement from humans, and more of that, I guess, not only existential longing, but that longing in terms of purpose and productivity in the workplace as well, because people are going to basically be responsible for maintaining the machines, and the machines will be the ones actually doing the work, making the decision points in the work. So we're all in effect going to become managers of machines who will have the job of filling out the actual task. Some think that's a great thing. Some think it's a panacea. Others think it's going to be destructive, and kind of what I think you're touching on. This idea is going to leave us hollow and feeling like there's really nothing of substance there.
Because I think we shouldn't get too carried away in the sense that it's just another tool. in the end. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the printing press think about what the printing press did, or what the wheel did, or the first chariots. I mean, it's a tool that's going to change society, but so much of our meaning, I think, in modern life and always comes from our work.
Yep.
The decisions we make is where we get meaning, no? And that's going to be reduced significantly in the next 15, 20 years, and I think what this is going to cause, it's going to cause a crisis of meaning, because it's easy to get lost in your work. I mean, with your type of job, I think you understand, when you're really working hard, it can give a lot of substance to a life.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's true, whether you're a farmer or a financier or a businessman.
Or a carpenter or whatever you do. I think you can get a lot of meaning, but we're going to lose a lot of that part. So I think there's going to be a crisis of meaning. And if you combine that with the collapse of traditional mythologies, they just don't work anymore. Yeah. Most myths don't work. And there's a little section that I put in. I know it's a little bit long in the film, but I think it's really important, where Campbell explains, the purpose of mythology. It has different purposes. In most mythologies, for example, traditional mythologies do not sync with modern scientific cosmologies. They don't. And that's a problem. It's a big problem.
Yeah, you have a phrase in the film that I really liked. I don't know if you coined it. I hadn't heard it before, but you called it pseudo-transcendent materialism. Can you?
That was mine. Yeah.
That's a good one. Can you kind of extrapolate a little bit on what you meant by that?
Right. Because this conversation we're having about AI, you'll find a lot of places in the world and on the internet where people will rant and rave how AI is the devil, it's the demon that's going to destroy us, and others, like you said, the panacea. I'm sort of very middle in the road. I think there's a lot of wonderful things this can do. And one, and two, we can't stop it anyway. It'd be like trying to stop the internet. Right. We're not going to stop it. But what happens is we're creating a mythology around this machine, and it's hollow. At first it's cool, no? There's that cool, neat kind of thing, but then at the end, it's just a machine. It's a Chinese, that thing about the Chinese box.
Yep.
In the end, it's a Chinese. The machine doesn't give meaning to anything. But we're creating a mythology around a machine. When traditional mythologies, if you dig deep enough, the mythology was about, in my opinion, was about consciousness. Yeah. So what do we put first? Is it the material world, or the awareness in which that material world, and the awareness in which we perceive the world, existence, reality? So there's sort of two parts to it. If you look at it from a Christian perspective, it's clearly in the archetype of the cross, the vertical line being the transcendent, what is beyond time and space, and the horizontal line, and you would connect that with the sun, for example. And the horizontal line is what is the moon, what's born and what dies, the material world.
Interesting.
What changes. And I think this materialist mythology has gotten way off the center on that horizontal line. Yeah. Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. It's actually profound. I as I'm thinking through what you're saying, I'm thinking about this idea of traditional transcendent values and the idea of, worship of deities, and the idea of finding, kind of our spiritual center within ourselves. In our modern world, I think it's undeniable that there's this sort of hero worship and celebrity worship kind of gets personified, like you and I were talking about earlier, with some of these cult of personalities and branding and the examples of progress, like an Elon Musk, but also in our celebrities, our pop stars. And another thing you talked about in the film was that exactly. And I think they kind of go hand in hand, this idea of the shifting toward a material dominated reality, and also this idea of the gods kind of shifting from the heavens into a more terrestrial plane and becoming the brands that we love, the pop stars that we love, the social activism. There's a line in your film where you said the gods haven't disappeared entirely. They've just been sublimated into brands, pop stars, things like that. And I agree with that 100%.
And social activism. Because I think a lot of people are really in need of stories that will feed their souls. And one of them is social activism.
Social
In the
justice,
sense of,
yeah.
if I can make the world a better place, my life will have meaning.
And at face value, that sounds good. That's not a bad thing. Social activism is great. The problem is if there's no underlying meaning behind it, the so what, then at the end of the day, it's kind of like a nihilistic worldview, right? Like there's no purpose to it. You're just doing it because it feels good, right? What's the foundation for it? That's my only pushback on social activism.
If anyone wants the key to this film, if they want sort of like, okay, decode it for me, just read 1 Corinthians 13. That's what I end the film. Because, a lot of people nowadays, at least I was brought up in a very Catholic family and all this. So, I knew Corinthians 13. But if you watch the end of the film, that's Corinthians is sung in Greek. And there's a line in Corinthians, I can't remember, I don't remember it exactly, but it's something like, I could have all the knowledge in the world. I could help all the people in the world. But if I don't have love, I'm nothing.
That's right.
And it's very important because all the social activism in the world, it's fantastic. And people should do all of the stuff that's been going on, I would say, in the last year with social activism. I think the motivation for most of it is really good. It's people trying to make a better world, which is great. But what's under it? Because what I often tell, especially younger people who are very emotional about these things is, okay, imagine I give you the magic wand and you pass the magic wand over the whole world. And none of all of these issues, I won't even mention them. It's not important. We fix the world. Then what? Do you know what I mean? Imagine the magic wand that fixed every possible issue that we don't even need to discuss. I don't even want to discuss them because then it becomes partisan. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
We fix them all. Then what? What meaning would you get from life?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to your previous film, 21 Faces of God, about this idea of a duality. Like there has to be something to be other. Like we have to have, humans would go crazy, I think, if there wasn't something to fix, something to improve, because that's just the way we're wired, right? There has to be some sort of duality, something that can always be juxtaposed.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing, I think, for people's personal narratives, because a lot of us say, and I think especially for younger people, I think it's entirely healthy to go out there in the world and, fight your battles, fall in love, have a career, do whatever you want to do, it's important. But there, around midlife, you've done it all and you realize, well, you know what? It's not bringing me the happiness I thought it would bring. And that's an inflection point in life. That's sort of, the knock on the door, like, you know what? That was great. You tried it. It didn't work. Now what?
Yeah.
And I think that's what I try and discuss in the last film, but I think more so in this one.
Yeah. I want to get back into the film in a second here, but before we do, this concept of love, and I did like the way you ended the film with the passage from 1 Corinthians. What I wanted to dive a little deeper on, and I'll jump to it now. This was farther down my question list, but since we're here, I think it's a good point to talk about it. The idea of love, because you ask anybody, whether it's a new age spiritualist, a Christian evangelical, pretty much anybody who's a humanist, they're going to tell you that love and, self-sacrifice for other people is the highest end in life. And I agree with that. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. My question goes back to, and, I don't know if anybody can really give a 100% accurate answer to this question because we're all terrestrial human beings, but what's your opinion on, okay, what's the so what behind love? Is this life kind of a platform for learning how to love? And is there some next level that we aspire to? Is the traditional idea of, heaven where we're judged by our works and, those who loved appropriately get in the gate? Like, does that exist? Or is there some other reason why love is the end all be all in the human experience? Because I think we are wired to perceive it as such. Yeah, because I do end the film with 1 Corinthians, but the film is not Christian. No. Yeah, certainly. That's why I asked.
But you know what I mean? I think I should be honest because I don't think it's fair not to be. In Vedanta, there's that idea of Sat Chit Ananda, which is being consciousness equals bliss. It's a very deep, difficult thing, but in a nutshell, when you understand that your consciousness is your being, your awareness is your being, you find bliss. And bliss is love. And what is love? It's being totally accepting of reality. That's how I would define love. And when that moment happens, you're in it. And that's as far, I don't think anyone needs to go any farther than that. The rest of it is just stories. Maybe they're true, maybe they're not. It doesn't matter. Yeah. When you're in that place, it all makes sense. And that's how I would define love. Bliss is love. Yeah. That's what, now I'm not saying that's how it's presented in the film.
It's interesting that in all of our popular films, action movies, dramas, you name it, and are also our historical narratives, the stories that have the most staying power and the ones that impact us the most are the ones about love, and not only love, but self-sacrificial love. I mean, look at the greatest story ever told, the story of, the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. I mean, there's a reason why that permeates through every culture, and it's basically bulletproof, is because there's nothing greater from the human mentality than self-sacrifice. That's why we venerate our soldiers and our war heroes above almost anybody else, because this idea of giving yourself for another is the most powerful story ever told. And it just, that's something that resonates in me very profoundly. And I was just wondering what your take was on that, because not only because you ended the film that way, but because it does seem like no matter what your worldview is, apart from like a purely materialist one, and even then I think most people would say that love is the underlying virtue, it makes you wonder, what is the end game, or what's the goal with this love that we all know is foundational to our existence?
I think love is it's the insight that there is no separation, that it's all one. So when somebody sacrifices themselves for someone else, it's complete acceptance of that we are one. If I die, if you die, it makes no difference. We're one.
Wow.
And I think that is maybe one of the highest sort of conceptual form. When you're trying to think what is love, I think that's about as high as that's pretty high.
That honestly, what you just said might be the best answer to that question I've ever heard. The realization that we're one. That's what it is. It's the portrayal of that in real life. It's the acting out the oneness. Because if you're willing to give up the thing that we hold most precious, which is our life, I mean, you could say it's something else, but obviously our life is foundational to everything. If we're willing to give that up for someone else, that is in effect demonstrating that we are one. We're the same. And that's, wow. Yeah. That's what very well said. I think I thought of it before, but I haven't gotten to the point as directly as what you just said. So that's really good. Okay. So getting back, wow, that was really good. So getting back into the film, this idea of materialism, and I think what you just laid out kind of explains the consequences of getting away from the transcendent nature and kind of just becoming a cyborg or a machine in the cog of the economic system we've created. You give a good little discourse on the way the banking system works in the modern world. And, a buddy of mine have done podcasts on this show about that in the past. We've talked about Bretton Woods. We've talked about 1913 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve and basically getting off a gold standard and money coming from nothing, et cetera. Can you kind of just tie together the loose ends in terms of why that matters? The fact that money can just be printed and that it's, you talk about it as an illusion. Can you kind of just extrapolate a little bit on the illusory aspect of money and how we kind of become slaves to the system as a means of, the way the powers that be have put together the banking system?
Yeah, absolutely. Now this topic can go off the rails so easily because it can fall into sort of crazy conspiratorial, this stuff. Money works quite well in our society as a means of exchange and as a store of value. So money works. And traditionally, for example, gold was money because it stored value. And what value did it store? The work it took to get an ounce of gold, could be stored in that ounce of gold, and you could exchange it for an equivalent amount of work from a fisherman. You get his fish. That's what basically defining money. I mean, would you agree with that? That's more or less as a store value, no?
Yes,
And
certainly.
a means of exchange. So that's been what money traditionally is, and that's our concept of money. So if I ask you, if you're my buddy at work and it's the end of the week and I got a date, and I say, hey man, it's the end of the month, can you lend me a couple $100? I'll pay you back next week. And you say, sure. You give me the money. What you're giving me is some of your work from last month, right?
Yeah.
So when I pay it back, you worked for that money. I work for my money and I give you back. It's basically you lent me your work and I give it back. But modern banking, there's kind of a twist here. They're not lending us the same thing that we're paying back. And I'm not saying it's some evil conspiracy, but most people don't understand that when a bank lends you money, all they're doing is just monetizing your promise, your note. They're creating a security. So you say, when I teach this in the university, I say, if I go to the supermarket and the girl says, okay, it's $30, and I write an IOU and I hand it to her, she's going to say, excuse me, sir. I mean, I'm sure you will pay it back, but I need the cash. So if I take that IOU to a bank, they say, sure, we'll monetize that piece of paper. We'll put $30 in your deposit in your checking account. Mm-hmm. But all they're doing is just creating a ledger of what they owe you. So do you see what I mean? There's something fundamentally, we think that we're borrowing somebody else's money, but they're just monetizing that IOU.
Right.
And there's something a little, deceiving. I mean, wouldn't you agree that there's a certain level of deception in this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, fractional reserve banking as well. The idea that you deposit money and the bank can go and loan out 90% of that. I mean, that's deception in and of itself. I mean, almost all
just remember, banks don't lend. They create.
Yeah, they just create. It's just moving digits on a keyboard, really. I mean, it's not real, which has kind of led to the birth of the next evolution in finance. Whether it's going to be Bitcoin, I don't know, but blockchain crypto seems to be a response to this idea of current monetary policy, because that advocates for an open ledger. So in theory, crypto will kind of do away with this problem of not being able to trace money or being able to just create it on a whim. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how that story is going to end, but it does seem like this is a problem that society is trying to solve for that very reason. But we all have become slaves to it.
For a second, it's a fascinating topic because you can't create Bitcoins. You can't just say, I'm gonna create a ledger. I owe you. Now, could you? This would be for another podcast with someone much more sophisticated financially than I am. But could you create a banking system where I could create the sense where I'm not creating Bitcoins? I'm just saying, okay, you want me to monetize that IOU? I owe you 500 Bitcoins.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's actually a fascinating, and I'm sure there are people working on this, where within modern banking, could we still use Bitcoin? I think it's probably possible. But not to digress too much, in the film, all I wanted to show was there's something that we all use that works wonderfully as a store of value and as a means of exchange, which is money. But fundamentally, most of us don't understand it. Most of us have absolutely no idea how money's created or even what it actually is. Yet we use it and it dominates our life. What about the other thing that's kind of important? Our consciousness? Do we really think about it in the sense of, do we understand what being conscious means? Especially within the materialist paradigm. And I think most of us probably haven't thought that much about it. We haven't thought much about what real money really is, and we haven't thought about consciousness. But if we begin to investigate them, it can really change the way you see the materialist paradigm that dominates not just Western culture, but it's beginning to dominate the entire world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then apart from the finance world, but in regards to the same concept of kind of being enslaved by a system. Another thing you touched on in the film that really hit home for me, and I'm sure you're well qualified to talk about this with a background in advertising, but you talk about Edward Bernays and the evolution of modern advertising. And that's always been a profound subject to me, because there does seem to be a big shift in like post World War II America, where I don't know if it was in the 50s, but some point in, the modern nuclear family America, there seemed to be this quick shift with the rise of the television, where you could just create loyal followers of a brand, not based on the product itself per se, but based on a story you tell around it, and based on, popular tropes that you could communicate through advertising. How has that impacted us, and where has that left us in terms of, how we interact with consumerism today?
Yeah, I have to give props to Adam Curtis, because Adam Curtis is a wonderful documentary filmmaker, big inspiration to me. And he made a documentary called The Century of the Self. And that's where that clip comes from Bernays. I took it from The Century of the Self. And that's a fabulous documentary that shows how commerce, instead of basically fulfilling people's needs, say in the 19th century, you need nails, come to the hardware store. You need potatoes, you go to or bread, you go to the bread store. In the 20th century, using psychology, what we learned to do was create the desire and then fulfill it. And that is a pretty modern idea, at least in the marketplace. And having worked in advertising, I realized that. I realized what I did working in digital marketing was throw an image out there. X% of people who see it will be affected by it, in the sense where I created the desire in them. And then how to fulfill the desire, I offer them a product or a service to fulfill that desire. So I'm creating the desires and then fulfilling them. Obviously, it's all statistics.
Yeah.
And that changed. Now, I worked in from like the late 90s to around 2010, and then I got into teaching and I kind of left that world. When I look now at what can be done, and I'm not exaggerating. I don't know how long I think you're probably younger than I am, but
yeah, I'm in my 30s.
I say what I had a bow and arrow in 2003, 2004, when I was doing my campaigns with Google and stuff. It's like I had a bow and arrow, and these guys now have like F-35s. I mean, it might be, when I look at what they can do now, it's extraordinary. It's with the data they have. I drool sometimes looking at that. How much money could I make with the tools these guys have,
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is evolving. And so how many of the desires and the stories that we believe and tell ourselves have been embedded in us by people simply trying to, make a buck? I mean, it sounds kind of vulgar, but that's something that people need to become more aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, in regards to the film itself, and I don't want to give away the ending, because I think you have a profound closing to the film before you even get to the love kind of trumps all passage, where you talk about the nature of the Archons and who the Archons are and how we get out of this mess we find ourselves in. We're moving at a pace, as far as I know, unknown to mankind. I don't think technology and progress have ever moved at the rate they're going. I mean, just yesterday, I saw pictures of the sunset on Mars, which, is wild to think that, that's possible. It makes me wonder, I think Kurzweil said 2040s, give or take, for the singularity, which is right around the corner. Makes me wonder, is there going to be, and this is just purely theorizing from your perspective, does this end in some sort of cataclysmic, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, 2040, maybe it's 100 years from now, but does this end in tears? Or is this kind of the birth pangs of some new version of humanity, and that there will be, new Archons and new, I guess, transcendent ideas that come out of this human 2.0 transformation that we seem to be living through right now? What's your take? Where do you land on that? Is this good, positive, or negative?
Honestly, I'm completely agnostic. I think it doesn't change anything because it's just a story.
Yeah.
Imagine if you were in Rome 2,000 years ago. You thought, God, this is amazing. And what we're going to find is a future that's very different, but we still relate to it only through our consciousness. That's it. We never actually interact with that material world. I mean, this goes back to Hume, philosophically. No matter what we see out there, that experience, it's experienced through our awareness. So while we change all the stories, do we actually change who we are? I don't think we do. So I think it goes back to who we actually, when you go back to what we actually are, and if we are basically our awareness, it has no qualities. There are no qualities to it, right? So our experience of the world, no matter what colors, what period in history you put there, does it actually change our experience fundamentally? I'm not sure it does. I'm really not sure it does. Does that make sense? Or
yeah, no, that makes sense. It makes me wonder, though, for the traditional idea, especially I'm thinking about nature when I say this, like the material world, the natural world around us, which, covered by concrete, covered by skyscrapers and buildings. Like, I can't help but notice that there seems to be a deterioration of everything that's organic and natural in the world on a accelerating scale. And if we do shift and become, kind of something resembling a Star Trek society where we go, off planet, extraterrestrial, and humans colonize other places, great. But if it comes at the cost of the destruction of this planet, and I don't want to get into kind of a woo-woo new age kind of mentality here. I just mean it in terms of just what is natural, what is pure, what transcends us, and what has been here longer than us, more so than anything, is nature. It's this planet. And it seems like so much of our progress comes at the cost and the expense of every other living species on this planet. So if we say that the story is just going to change, it's going to be a new story, I guess my natural response is, at what cost? I mean, maybe for us the story changes, but it seems like there are actual casualties in this, shifting narrative.
Sure. No, I mean, there definitely are. The only problem with that argument is there's a separation between human culture and nature. And if you flew in from from another galaxy, would that person see any separation at all? Would there be the slightest thing unnatural about, walking down Fifth Avenue as compared to walking through a forest? That's the only thing I would say. Do you know what I mean? That we see it that way, but is it really that way?
Right. From an outsider's perspective, I get it. Like, if we were to interact with alien life and ran into their civilization, you're right. We wouldn't know what came before or how they engage with their own world.
How would they distinguish between what they saw? Would they say, "Oh, well, this is a really cool ant colony in Earth around"? I don't really know exactly how that experience is. And the other thing is, when we put it in perspective, if the Earth is 4 billion years old, is that right? 4 billion, something like that.
Allegedly, it may be older. Who knows?
Yeah, it could even be older, right? And we're human civilization, say Homo sapiens have been around for about 200,000 years. And you could say sort of historical man is 15,000 years, 20,000 years, something like that.
Right.
So when you put it in perspective, what are we going to look like in 2,000 or 3,000 years? Are we even going to be here? It's when you look at it in those perspectives, I think when you just step back a little bit, it probably doesn't seem as dramatic. But for us, it's going to be dramatic. And you said you have kids. Now I have a daughter. She's 29. The world she's going to see when she's my age. Yeah. The thing is, we can't even really imagine. And I have a pretty good imagination. I can't really imagine it. It's beyond my imagination. I don't think even a good science fiction writer can really imagine what the world's going to be like in 50 years, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to comprehend. I mean, things have changed so much even since I was a child. You'd say the same. I mean, it's just, we're moving at such a uncomparable pace. I don't really know what to expect 10, 15 years from now, the accelerated pace of change. But that's why I say your film is so timely, because I mean, you're releasing this at a time where I think so many people are scrambling, looking for meaning. People have been locked in their homes for the greater part of a year now, figuring out the real dynamic, not only of how they engage with the world themselves, but how they engage with the people in their lives. I mean, divorce, suicide, domestic abuse, all those things. I bet we're going to look back at the statistics over the last year. We're going to be shocked, when the dust settles on all this. Yeah.
And I would tell people, please pay attention to your kids with phones, because, as a teacher, I teach at the university level. So they're between 18 and 21. These kids have had iPhones now for, since they were basically 9 or 10 years old.
Right.
And the effects on them psychologically, socially, the way they interact with each other, their attention levels, depression, suicide. I mean, the data is out there. If you want to see it, just Google it. Look at suicide rates among adolescents, put it in a graph, and look what happens around, 2010, 11, 12. This stuff is really, really dangerous, extremely dangerous. And so there are things, while I think you and I would agree, can we change the overarching sort of direction of history? No. But there are certain things we can say, hold on, maybe it's a good idea that, we don't give kids this stuff till their brains are fully formed, for example. Agreed.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to tell, when I show people those stats, and they're public, I mean, you can look at them. I said, if you told parents, you give your kids Snicker bars and there's a 30% increase in suicide rates, depression, the time they start to date, when they get their driver's license, would parents let their kids eat Snickers bars? They would say, no way. So there are things we can do, just practical things. And I think we need to be careful with some of them, because for some reason, I think we're not having this discussion in a broader sense, because there's probably a lot of guilt involved. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so, there's stuff that we have to be really careful with.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know where it all ends, but in some regards, I agree that things are just going to run their course, and we're going to discover new norms, and, we'll tell ourselves new stories, and there will be new narratives that arise out of this, but there are going to be casualties as well. And it's unfortunate, but I mean, I've seen it happen. Well, I don't want to give away the end of your film, but I highly recommend everybody go and watch it. Much shorter than the 21 Faces of God series. You can watch this in less than an hour. It's on YouTube. I will link to it in the show notes. Definitely worth your time, guys. Especially now, I think this is a very timely film. So, Robert, thank you for putting this together and releasing it to us now. I think you touched on a lot of things here that we can only scratch the surface on in this podcast that I think are not only timely, but just essential in terms of figuring out how to navigate through our own current, many existential crises and existential self-discovery that we're going through, because so many people right now are in a place of, just knowing that something's missing and maybe not being able to pinpoint what it is, but something is missing. Maybe they're, struggling financially, maybe they're doing great financially, but either way, I think people have this sense of just something's not there. And I think it's tapping into this other side, this transcendent nature. So, again, just congratulations on the film. I hope it does really well for you. And before I let you go, do you have anything else going on? Anything else in the works coming after this one?
No, I think the tank's a bit empty. I kind of emptied the tank with this one, and I think I'm gonna take a break. But really, thanks for having me on. It was a great conversation, and I really appreciate it.
All right, anytime. If you ever do, get the muses back and have another film, let me know, and I'd love to have a conversation about that one as well.
Sounds great. Take care.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.